All right, we are moving on to 2.3 day 2. We are continuing with our conditional statements, but we're looking at making the converse of these statements, or the inverse, or the contrapositive. So our statement that we are dealing with as an example is, if it is Independence Day, then it is July. So let's break this down into our hypothesis and our conclusion. So remember, our hypothesis always comes after if. So it is Independence Day is our hypothesis, and our conclusion typically, most of the time, comes after then. So then it is July is our conclusion. Now, is this statement true or not? We talked about truth value previously, and that is whether the statement is true all the time. So if it is Independence Day, when does Independence Day happen? Independence Day happens July 4th. There is no other Independence Day in the US other than July 4th. So if Independence Day is occurring, then it has to be in July. That is true. So our truth value for this conditional statement is true. Conversely, or the converse, is when we switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So we trade places. This includes the if and then. We change the whole makeup of this statement. So our previous conditional statement said, if it is Independence Day, then it is July. The converse tells me to swap the hypothesis and conclusion. If stays in the same place. So if it is July, then it is Independence Day. Now, is this true? Is that possible? If it is July, then it is Independence Day. Independence Day is one day in the entire month of July. So what if I picked July 6th, July 30th, July 27th? Are those Independence Days as well? No, they're not. So our truth value is false. And an example of that would be July 6th, July 7th, July 30th. Any date other than July 4th, which is Independence Day here in the US, would make the statement false. So if it is July, then it is Independence Day, is the converse of our previous conditional statement, but it has a truth value of false. The inverse now is the negation, where we negate. And when we say negate, that means we're adding the word not, don't, or won't, or something similar to that, to the hypothesis and the conclusion. So we go back to our original conditional statement. If it is Independence Day, then it is July. And I'm going to add the word not to both sections of this statement. If it is not Independence Day, then it is not July. So if it is not Independence Day, then it is not July. Well, let's look at this for our truth value. If it is not Independence Day, then it is not July. So that's saying if it is not July 1st, July 4th, then we are not in July. Well, what about July 7th? What about July 31st? What about July 1st? Independence Day does happen in July, but it is not the only day that occurs within the month. So this truth value is false as well. And for example, we could say July 7th. But there's a multitude of days in July that are not Independence Day. Now, our last switch on this hypothesis conclusion conditional statement is the contrapositive. And the contrapositive is a mix between converse and inverse. We are going to switch our statements and negate them. So again, we're dealing with if it is Independence Day, then it is July. If we switch that, we take the converse and it says it is July, then it is Independence Day. But then I take that converse and I negate it. So if it is not July, then it is not Independence Day. So let's think about that truth value. If it is not July, then it is not Independence Day. So if we are not in the month of July, Independence Day is not happening in the US. And that is true because Independence Day only occurs on July 4th in the US. Therefore, if it is not in the month of July, then Independence Day is not happening. So the truth value is true.